the sessions for clergy, one with Carla Grolsch-Miller and Hilary Eisen, and the other with Chris Southgate and Stephen Torr. Perhaps we've all been in conversations recently in the past few weeks about what kind of world we're entering as we ease out of lockdown. And my own feeling, which is just an opinion, my own feeling is we are entering a changed world. We're not going back to normal. We're not going back to the same world. And I think that changed world is a world that holds many opportunities for us in the church, for Christians to engage more widely and more deeply with people in our everyday lives. Speaking for myself, we may be tired and perhaps emotionally drained, but my sense is of new things. We are called to new things in reorientation in the church and in the parish. So my title attempts to embrace that sense of pandemic, of orientation, of reorientation, and the freshness of new things in view alongside our tiredness. And I want to suggest that one of the things that will be enabling in that changed world, in our reorientation, is conversation, because of the quality of the space that it opens up. So just for us to get in a mood of sharing and talking with each other, I wonder if I can ask you to share in some breakout rooms some of those ideas of new things as we emerge from lockdown, some possibilities that you've been talking about. And if we can do that, say in groups of 3 or 4, and then just hear a little bit of feedback. And if we just take 5 minutes in the room, some ideas about new things in church or in the parish. And David, as soon as you're ready. And they don't have to be things about conversation, they're simply new things, new possibilities that are suggesting themselves.
Okay, off we go.
Hi David, it's Giselle here.
Hello, Giselle.
I've been struggling because I'm at work. The Wi-Fi is really bad, but I've just managed to connect through my phone now.
I'll join you with room 5, okay?
Thank you.
Any excuse. Any excuse.
So was there a question?
Well, did you hear Rob's question or not?
No, I missed that. I had to literally, I did have to take the dog outside because he wouldn't leave to go for a walk.
Got that wrong.
No, don't worry. It's clearly going to be one of those days for me.
Just a moment. I might not be able
As
to
you'll
do
notice,
it.
I've not even got my dog colouring because I forgot that this morning.
Let me see if I can join you now. No, you'll have to miss out on that group. Sorry about that.
Don't worry, it's
I can't remember what the question was
walking around the. Sorry?
I can't remember what the question was either.
No, well, I missed it because I was getting it very fragmented. So I've missed the whole beginning. I moved to a different part of the building, but thinking it would improve, and then
Hello.
Hi, Rob, it's Giselle here. I was struggling with the internet, so I ended up not being in a room at all. And I missed out on the beginning of your session because the internet was so poor. I've connected through my phone now, so hopefully I should be able to participate a bit more easily.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you are welcome to listen because I wasn't in a group either. So we're the listeners, Giselle.
That's good.
Good, we're all back. Thank you. So would anyone like to just share one thing as an example of a new thing that's been in your conversations?
It's quite boring, but we've already changed the way that we're doing PCC.
Thank you. Any other new ideas?
Because of the pandemic, I was assigned by the bishop to pioneer into a new housing estate, and that's been really hard. So it's been like trying to think of ways to like connect with a community through communication that is not necessarily through person to person, and that's been really strange. But thinking about like starting a podcast and things like that, which I would have never ever thought of before the pandemic. So
yeah. Have we one more?
Yeah, well, I can. What the church, what's done differently now is that churches are now meeting together for the first time. Saying in our group, you know, I've got 5 churches and 5 different churches. All of a sudden, because of Zoom and that, they're all coming together and meeting each other, which they never would have done prior to this. So hopefully that kind of thing will carry on as well.
Good, good. Okay. That was to enable you to talk, but just to give me some sense that I'm not the only one seeing possibilities for new things. And I think conversations will be one of those possibilities, part of those possibilities. So thank you for what you fed back. I'm using a script, by the way. I've never presented on this before, so I've scripted myself something, and I'm happy just to share that with you as it is. I may or may not be following it, but you're welcome to have a copy afterwards if you'd like it, if that's helpful. And I'd be really pleased for any feedback. This first half, until we have a break, and I don't know quite what half means, but nevertheless, is kind of semi-structured because I've scripted it, just to put it into some kind of sense. But the second half, we'd probably be a bit looser, where we might get a feel for the kind of topics that are attracting interest and then pursue 3 or 4 of those in a looser way. So I want to tell you about my unintended journey, a journey I didn't realize I was on, that I started in 2012. And it's a journey where I first met Jen. We joined a new group that was set up in its first year to explore the Old Testament together. And we were going to meet something like 35 times that year. And if I say out of that group that met, which met in Helsby, there were 9 of us, and including Jen and I, 4 of us are now ordained. So that's as it's turned out, but in some way it speaks of the quality of conversation of that group. It's not proof, but it's quite interesting, isn't it? That would be an unusual statistic, that you ended up from a small group with 4 people ordained. It used an open conversational style, and we got to know each other. and we learnt about the Old Testament. We were encouraged to ask questions and then to listen to each other's responses. And I want to try this phrase, that in a modest way, it had something of theological conversation in its qualities. It included a short time of worship. And we also practiced theological reflection, which we did using a four-source model. And that itself is a model of conversation, if you're not familiar with it. The four sources are brought into conversation with each other. And two of those are personal sources, which are personal experience, and then separately, what we can describe as your position. And if you like, that's your response to those experiences. We know that commonly a group of people who experience the same thing can have quite diverse responses, and they adopt different positions as a result of that experience. So those are the two personal sources. And then the other two are corporate sources, and they are the source of tradition, in our case, the Christian tradition, be that scripture or church tradition or those kind of examples. And then wider society and culture. What does our culture say to us about a topic that we want to examine? And through those conversations and those theological reflections, I came to feel, to appreciate how much other people teach me, how much the other people in that room taught me. And I can honestly say I had experiences of being astonished by what people taught me and who taught me. It was a very humbling experience, encountering other people and their views and their experiences and their insights. Absolutely remarkable. I suppose that was the beginning of my starting to understand that our learning is not really primarily about what I learn. Although in my experience, education is trying to convince me that my learning is most important. Being in conversation groups has taught me that's not true. It is about what we learn. And I've become rather passionate about that, because in churches, it is the we-ness, if you like, of the church that matters. How the body of the church learns, how we treat each other. So how we learn started to come to the fore even in that 1 year. And that group then ran on. And for reasons of training, I had to leave that group because my training was the same night. But as it turns out, I started a group. I'd learnt quite an amount from that group, and I started a group in Chester. And that group ran for 5 years. And I didn't realize, but I volunteered to facilitate the group, and I hosted it in my house. And it was a modest size, 5, 6, 7 people, that kind of size. And across churches, not belonging to one church. And over 5 years, that group taught me enormously, but I didn't realize that it had. We met about 150 times, just to give you an idea of the scale of the learning opportunity. So in 150 times meeting, I learned a great deal. And one of the things I want to draw out from that is about the importance of the group and the notion of the voice of the group. This is something there's no one point at which to talk about it, but I'd rather talk about it sooner than later. That I think in a good conversation group, there's one more voice than the total number of individuals. So each individual has a voice, and it's really, and the respect and the listening we have for each voice is really important. But the amazing voice is the voice of the group. And I don't know whether in saying that that's meaningful, but the more I've come to believe in the voice of the group, the more I've heard the voice of the group. And I think the voice of the group is spoken through individuals, but also in, as it were, the demeanor of the group, and possibly in the silence of the group. And I want to try out that idea. And if anybody's willing to give me any feedback, just tell me whether that idea of the voice of the group is one that resonates with you fairly readily, or how it resonates with you, or whether it doesn't seem to strike a chord at all. So I'm happy to take any feedback on that.
I feel like I'm regularly formed by groups of people, and I feel like I always have been. Like when I first became a Christian, I couldn't read very well, and so my experience of Jesus was through people. And so that for me, I think is such a big part of me forming as a person.
Thank you, Hannah. Anyone else like to just offer back? Claire.
I was just thinking in terms of what sort of groups I've been involved in, and that they are all made of individuals. And one of the things I would probably say, and I know lots of my St. Mellitus colleagues will groan, but it's my experience of the Northumbria community. As a dispersed community, there are lots and lots of voices throughout the UK and throughout the world. But there is something about when those voices come together and they hold the same ethos and they hold the same principles that actually makes it more than its sum of parts. We can each hold it, but actually as we share it together, it becomes stronger.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I take both those as very encouraging. Thank you. I want to suggest a visual image, and I hope that's helpful. I hope you bear with me if you don't find this idea of the group voice resonant. And the image is of us sitting in a circle, but there being an extra chair, and the extra chair is empty. And I want to suggest that sitting there is the most perceptive and the most intelligent speaker. And I don't know of any science behind this, and I don't say it with any theory in mind, but I honestly think that if we are able to discern the voice of the group, we will hear things that we will not hear from individuals. One of the ways I came across this in that original group, in our theological reflections, I think it's fair to say, and Jen will probably nod, we were typically baffled by the process of theological reflection. Yeah, absolutely. And it's widely recognized that it's the kind of thing you've got to do until you get it. And until you get it, you don't get it. But that's okay, that's just the way it is. And I learned to facilitate theological reflections, and I began to notice the voice of the group. And the way I would put it, and I hope this is helpful, is that almost literally each individual would tell me quite authentically that they did not understand what we were doing or where we were going. But the conversation would never falter. And we would get to the end, whatever the end means. These things don't necessarily have a formal end, but we would get to the end and everyone would have told me they did not know what they were doing. They were confused. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. Because the group was not confused. The group was not unable to respond. I do not recall any occasion when the group could not respond. And that for me was a really strong example of the group speaking. Again, literally through individuals. It's not a mysterious voice, but it does say things that the people as individuals don't realize how full or how pertinent or how important the words are. And those words are spoken by the group. Well, I hope that illustrates something. I think I would add to that in my experience in a regular group, it probably takes several or many weeks before the group starts to appear. But it's probably a particular comment, which is a bit of a wow comment, and you think that's interesting. Where is that from? I didn't expect that. And I would suggest that's the beginning of the group. The group is starting to speak. We may or may not return to that, but I wanted to make that observation, the most powerful voice in my experience. In all I'm going to say, I want to draw attention to the fact that these are intentional conversations. There's nothing wrong with ordinary conversation. Ordinary conversation is fine, but the word intentional implies that people have come with intent. They've turned up for a reason. And that sense of turned up, I think, is quite important, because the quality of the conversation does depend on people turning up. I don't know much about football, but one of the things I've heard over the years is people talking about the team that was on the pitch, but they never turned up. And conversations, I think, have that kind of dependence. And I think the notion of intentional conversation suggests that degree of intention, that probability that people are going to turn up, they are actually going to enter into the conversation. So I'm going to move on now. Just out of interest, I've also become interested in the idea of panels. And what is a panel? Well, it's just a thing. And if we were talking about art, we might be talking about a picture, or we might be talking about a panel that had 2 or 3 pictures on it. And for whatever reason, I find the idea of panels really helpful, to the extent that my sermons are never long, but I always break them up. Probably because I personally don't have a very long concentration span. So I always think of a sermon as 3 or 4 panels, and I literally stop when I finished a panel and start a new one, because it just gives me a chance to reset. I mention that because I think conversation can have that quality as well. And that may be something that the group manages. This group which has the voice may also channel the conversation into panels. It creates shape with its words, with what it wants to say. And that's part of the way that it uses space. So I'm going to start a new panel. I've talked about that group in which I shared. And now I'm going to talk about a different kind of conversational group with a different organization. And it was from that organization that I read from the Latin inscription, or its translation, which is above their house. It was started in 2017 to reintroduce the practice of retreat into the city centre in Chester. Up to about 25 years ago, there was a residential retreat house in Chester, but it closed. And so in 2017, this small charity started an initiative to bring a day retreat, a possibility of finding a space for retreat in the city. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this is called Retreat House Chester, and some of you may have come across them, but they're a relatively new organisation. They're small, and I think it's very interesting how they do things. I went to a few of their opening events, and one of the first was on a Saturday from 10:30 till 3, and a man called Mark Davis was speaking. And he was speaking, his topic was graceful conversation. And his interest was, and I've written it down, how we talk gracefully to each other about things we don't necessarily find it easy to talk together about. And I was looking at some notes I found that I made on the day, and I made loads of notes because what he was saying on that day seemed very resonant to me. And it was, let's think, it was 6 years after I'd been to that first conversation group, which was, I said, the start of my journey without knowing it was the start, where I met Jen. So 6 years later, I heard this man, Mark Davis. And I came away from those 5 or so hours with 3 things. The first was his idea of what conversation is. The second was the importance of silence in conversation. And the third was how much what he'd said had resonated with me. And I realized, and I didn't put it into words straight away, but I just had an overwhelming feeling that I knew this stuff. And what I would now say is that's what the groups had taught me. I had been taught what it was he was saying, but he put it into words for me, and it was the groups who gifted it to me. So I want to say something about 2 words, which are the words conversation and discussion. And the first thing I want to say is that I fully realize that in ordinary English, we more or less use these words interchangeably. So I get that. And personally, I'm not someone who feels strongly about defining words. I'm not, in fact, I get slightly irritated if somebody wants to define them too much. So I've absolutely no problem with saying that we use the words interchangeably, but I want us to hear these so that they're not interchangeable. And if you're okay with that, I'm not trying to tie down their definition, but I'm trying to be helpful. So what Mark pointed out to us was that the root of the word conversation is actually a monastic root. And it has the sense of living together with. Living together with. So the root of the word has a sense which comes from living, not from talking. The idea of conversation as talking is a relatively late development. And then I want to contrast that with the word discussion. And the root of the word discussion comes from this notion, dash to pieces. Which is a rather strange thing, dash to pieces. But that's the root of discussion. And if I say some other words, you will perhaps hear that. If I said to you percussion, well, you hit the drums, don't you? You beat them. Or if you suffered concussion, you'd have had a hit on the head. Or if there were repercussions, something would have gone wrong. And in discussion, you dash to pieces. So you can see there's a point to be made. Again, I don't want to make you anxious about how you use the words, but I think it's useful to reflect on that. So let's imagine a scenario where you want to talk about something. And let's bear in mind that in conversations, in discussions, not everybody's good at finding words. And let's bear in mind that not everybody is a great listener. So if you wanted to talk with people about their faith, about your faith, I want to ask you, would you rather be in a conversation or a discussion? And I want to suggest that we go into breakout rooms, and this time for 8 minutes. Give yourselves a bit more time and just reflect about entering into talking about people's faith, about their faith, about your faith, bearing in mind the two different sources from which those words come, conversation and discussion. And then as a group, just reflect, would you rather be in a conversation or in a discussion about faith? And in the way you talked, what would you hope for in the quality of that talking together? And a few suggestions that you might make about what you'd hope for in the way you talk. So David, if you'd arrange those. Well, you're muted, but.
Do you want to be part of a group, Rob?
Well, on this occasion, I'm happy to be, but if the group would prefer I don't say much, I'm very happy to not say much.
So I put you into you're in a group ordinarily, because that's the way it works. And I'll open the rooms, and I'll join one of the rooms as well.
So would you rather be in a conversation or a discussion? And what would you hope for in the way you talk together?
That was such a juicy question.
Was that a discussion, debate, or deeper?
No, it's just a compliment. I just that was a really helpful question. So thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
We'll just wait till everyone's back.
I think everybody's back then, Rob.
Okay. Well, some feedback. What were your feelings about whether you'd prefer a conversation or a discussion, and what kind of thoughts did that produce?
I don't mind going, Rob. Oh, go on, you go first.
I think we felt there were different contexts with which conversation and sorry, my brain's lost it now. And the other discussion were appropriate, but I think we came to the conclusion that actually conversation was probably something that people willingly participated, and there was no agenda for us to actually come to any conclusion or take on board the information that was being shared, whereas a discussion had an agenda, and there was a cause of group need to be singing off the same song sheet and coming to the same conclusion at the end, whether you externally or internally agreed with it. So there were, it was all about context, really.
Oh, thank you. I think that's very helpful. Yes, thank you.
was kind of drawn to the fact that I can't have a discussion and a conversation. I need both, especially where theology is concerned. If we're considering that a discussion is to kind of dash things to pieces, I have to be able to have a discussion to break something down, to then be able to process it for it to become a conversation, especially if it's a learning opportunity. So it's, you know, it's more academically based. I thrive on the idea of having a discussion with people, whether I agree or disagree, breaking it down to then have the conversation that almost remolds it together. Again, not necessarily with a mutual agreement, but at least with a mutual conversation. So kind of having one with the other works best for me in a learning environment.
Thank you. Again, that's very helpful. Of course, one is not saying that those sources are definitions, and you're pointing out how their difference can be useful. So thank you. Have we got a third?
Rob. Unmute.
We were saying, well, I was saying in our group that I find that a conversation can lead then onto a debate, but I've always found it very awkward or strange for then a debate to go onto a normal conversation afterwards, because normally by the time you got to that debate stage, you are maybe butting heads a little bit, and so it's very difficult then straight away go into a conversation. But it's quite easy to go from a conversation then into a debate.
Okay, thank you. But it's interesting, we get that idea of heads butting. I mean, that sounds like we might be dashing to pieces soon. Yeah.
We talked a bit about issues around power, that a discussion can very often end up with the strongest voice being dominant and driving the outcome of the discussion. Whereas in a conversation, you're actually giving up power. So you're seeking to hear each other and actually even enter into the other person's point of view to properly understand where they're coming from.
Thank you. I think all those are very helpful. What I'm trying to do is to compress a conversation, even if let's say we have an hour and a half by the time we finish with breakouts and breaks. The whole topic actually takes a long time to absorb. And I'm just introducing these ideas about conversation and discussion to characterize. And I'm going to choose to talk about conversation. I'm going to choose this notion of living together as more likely to sustain new things. Now, none of that is proof, and none of it means you have to use the words as I'm suggesting. But the rest of my assumptions follow on from that. They do not prove that conversation is always good and that discussion is bad. And in those things you volunteered, you've made some very helpful points about, Debbie, for example, how it is both and, not either or. That they have different outcomes, and one might be neutral. Well, it depends what you want. It depends on the context. But where we're trying to consider something that is graceful, something that is new, something that is open to all, I'm going to suggest that conversation might be a more helpful word. I don't want to force that on you, but that's the way I'm going to use it, because I'm in a compact space trying to say something. I think there's good reason to see conversation as having a priority in this talking together. But I'm leaving that to you to decide, bearing in mind that the word I'm going to take forward is conversation for the purpose of this conversation, if you're okay with that. Does that make sense to people? I hope I'm not confusing. I don't want to force something on you, I'm saying, but I think it's a helpful word, conversation, in this context. Again, I remind you, you're welcome to have my script and to read over it and reflect for yourselves. I think that's really important. If you want to do that, you're very welcome to. This isn't about me being right. I'm reporting what I've received, what I've been taught, and what it's meant to me, and I'm sharing it with you. What about any feedback on thoughts about how you might talk together rather than what word is overarching? What would you hope for in the talking together? I don't know if you had a chance just to think about that, to reflect on that. What would you hope for? Any suggestions there? Martin.
I think just understanding, Rob, both directions, my understanding of their worldview, point of view, not just necessarily the point that they're coming out with, but also where that point is coming from, and their understanding of me. Yeah, Claire's put it there. Mutual reciprocity. I think that is articulates it very well.
Yeah, thank you.
Something that we brought up with this idea of actually being able to disagree well. And currently within culture, you can't disagree well. If you disagree, therefore you become, the polar opposite and the enemy. You can't choose to remain friends if you fundamentally disagree on something. So there's that issue there, again, sort of what Martin's saying, that mutual exchange of words, about being gracious with each other within the listening, and actually choosing to disagree well, but remaining, positive or, pleasant within that, or affirming even maybe.
Okay, thank you.
But also, there is an element that I have experienced where even though people appear to be disagreeing well, there is an underlying politics within, let's say, the group of people that regularly meet to have conversations or discussions, and that ends up being the power and the influence. So it's like a unsaid, unspokenness.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Heather.
Sorry. We in our group spoke about how conversation almost needs an unhurriedness, willingness to wait. And that if there's a rush and if there's an agenda, if 20 people have to make a point within 10 minutes, then you're not going to get a conversation. And it just struck me as you were talking that I could be wrong on this, but one of the ways I think about the living in love and faith issue is that we've tried discussion and now we're trying to have a conversation.
That's very useful. Thank you. Yes. I'm going to move on if that's okay, but thank you for all those. I'm going to move on because time is going on and we'll be ready for a coffee soon. But I just want to do one section, and I think that's very relevant here, because it turns out that I have learned in groups that have been facilitated. I can't remember, I don't think I probably used that word. And I don't think it's coincidental that I've learned what I've learned in groups that are facilitated. You realize that the notion of facilitation is to make easier. But I think it does turn out to be critical to the quality of the conversation, to choose that word conversation. Facilitation is critical. So I'd like to screen share, because I've got some words written down and it's probably easier to show So you have a sense of getting a handle on the things, the collection of things I'm saying. You can have a copy of it anyway, but it just may make you feel like you can see what's going on. So see if I can find, oh yes, I'm going to share, I'm sharing onto the wrong screen, but I'll change it. Well, I won't change it. Okay, I'll. Now, unfortunately, I seem to have lost control. So I've neither, I can blag on, but I can neither stop the share, nor can I switch to the tab which I actually want. The joys of Zoom.
I can stop you sharing, Rob, if that's going to.
Please do, please do.
Well, I thought I could. No, that's not working either.
David, maybe if you went for a break now, everybody signed out and come back in again.
We seem to be stuck, don't we? Rob, where have you gone?
He probably took my advice and signed out, has he?
No, I think he's having technical problems because he's blacked out, isn't he? So he's got internet issues, and that's probably why he's struggling to achieve what he wants to achieve.
Let's have, shall we have a 10-minute?
Oh, there.
Shall we have a 10-minute break? Rob isn't back with us.
He might have to sign out and back in again. I think that's what he's doing.
Yeah, but if we all go for a 10-minute break, grab a coffee, and we'll come back. Hello, Rob. We're just doing a 10.
Talking in the context of Retreat House Chester, which have a certain style of conversation. So there's a welcoming of the group and enabling the group to not only be present, but to become present. So getting people into the space, and that requires a little bit of time. Inviting us to say how we are as we arrive, because conversation is affected by the state we're in. And sometimes people say, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I'm a bit distracted today. Well, actually, it's material to the conversation. But if you're distracted, you're distracted. That's okay. Just say you are. It's not a problem. And then introducing the topic, because the conversations as intentional conversations almost always will have a theme. Even if you're studying the Bible, they will have a theme. In the case of Retreat House Chester, for example, recently we've done some on the theme of thresholds. And the conversations are in short series, perhaps 4 conversations, 6 conversations. And those might be styled things like 1 week crossing the threshold, and the next thing, God. The next week, God at the threshold. The facilitator has introduced the topic. They then will introduce some materials. In Retreat House Chester, there are some materials, or if you want to call them resources, which can be things like images, prose or poems or prayers that speak to the theme. But they might speak in rather indirect ways, or ways that are indirect for me, but very accessible for you. And that's all right. Because what we then do is take time. And here we get to the shaping the silence. It's usual after we see those materials, resources, to then have something like 20 minutes silence. And remember, this is about conversation, but we're sitting in silence. And typically you would give 20 minutes and just say to people, just sit with those materials and see what they say to you, see what you feel. And then we gather people back together and say, will you just say one thing? So facilitating becomes about setting the stall out for conversation and then having the conversation. So 5 minutes and then 35 minutes preparing before you start the conversation. So you've gone 40 minutes before you even start the conversation. And one might say, you then only have time for 40 minutes conversation. I hope these being on screen, the words, the figures I'm saying are making some sense, that one invests time in preparing for conversation so that the group is in a common place and then start the conversation. But even the start of the conversation is very gentle. Allow each person to say one thing from what they've seen in their reflection. And then say, okay, let's start the conversation. And allow 10 minutes to end. Now the facilitator's managing that time. And then crucially, and I think this answers a number of points that have been made really, that the facilitator is modeling, is role modeling the behavior that we want. So the facilitator is trying to moderate behavior if it's disruption or interrupting or unhelpful, but more particularly is modeling good behavior, because they're also a participant. So they're trying to demonstrate what good behavior is, not because they're super at it, but just because they're being really attentive to it. And that behavior is about creating the space that nurtures respect and listening and openness and sharing and truth. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing at that, because that's, as it were, the mechanics of facilitating. I wanted to say something about, well, what, so what, you know, that's how you do it, but so what? And here's some of the so whats from my own experience. So that's a little bit about facilitating. I would say, in my experience, that the less we speak, the more we say. So in a 90-minute session, we've used half of the time before we even start a conversation. We're using a facilitator. But curiously, my experience is the less we speak, the more we say. In those conversations, there's a great stress on asking people, will you just say one thing? I don't know, I've quite intentionally done it. You probably didn't notice. After you've come back from breakout rooms, I've been saying, will you say one thing? Well, this is a very typical phrase in Retreat House Chester. And what it's trying to say is, will you each one say one thing? But if you don't want to say something, that's fine. But please allow every voice to speak. That's the message. Please allow every voice to speak. And the only way to allow every voice to speak is to allow space for this voice to speak. This is not a competition. And it is that point of taking time, of not rushing, and allowing people when they're ready to speak, because it's an inclusive conversation. And similarly, in that first stage of, would you like to just offer your one thing? And that's on offer to the group, by the way. You don't offer it to a person, because you're then staring them in the face. You're pressurizing them, which you would never do. You're asking the group, would you like to say one thing? And you allow the space that everyone can say one thing, but don't enforce it, because that would be pressure. However, what you do not want is people starting to interact, because it stops somebody making the one precious thing they were going to offer. You steal their space when you react. So we discourage people reacting. We more positively, we ensure people don't respond until everyone's had that chance to share their one thing. So in addition, taking time, once a conversation starts, taking time before you respond. Because from ordinary conversation, if people don't take time before they respond, what they do is react. In other words, their mouth's already open and the words are already coming out before they've finished hearing what's just been said. I'm a slow thinker, and I know I'm already halfway through the sentence and I'm thinking, oh, I didn't hear what's they said, but it's too late. And if a facilitator models good behavior, then they encourage a gap. And the gap is sufficient for you to realize, oh no, I won't say. And then it turns out, because you've just felt it's right not to say, as an ordinary participant, you've suddenly realized, you thought the better of saying what you were going to say. Somebody then makes a stunning comment. You would have crowded it out, but your gift is you didn't open your mouth. Of course, you're free to open your mouth. You're free to open your mouth, but it is amazing what you creating space by not saying something enables somebody else to say. And this is the power of silence. I haven't got this in the script. Many years ago, I went to hear Alfred Brendel play in the Bridgewater Hall, and he's technically brilliant. He got a standing ovation at the end. That was a foregone conclusion because he's brilliant. And in a standing ovation, you don't know why everybody else is standing. You just know that they are. And why I was standing was because of his mastery of the silence. It wasn't his playing. It was the absolute respect he had for the silence. And even now, I find that really emotional, his relationship with the silence. And that taught me something about conversation. Those moments you hold of silence can be very precious to enabling somebody else to speak, somebody who may otherwise not speak. And those words will be lost, because for most of us, they come into our mind and they go out of our mind. So the silence is incredibly precious. And I'm sure your experience too is that God is in the silence. God is listening even more intently than we are. So taking time after somebody has spoken before we respond and decide if we're going to respond. By the way, these conversations are flowing. And they're not hopeless and hesitant and halting, but they're very graciously flowing. I think that the last thing I'd say is that although I refer to materials, there's a very happy phrase that the conversation is not about what we get out of those materials. It's about what the materials get out of us. It's about enabling ourselves, enabling each other. And our listening is crucial in that enabling, as is our willingness to speak when we want to speak. And of course, there are times when it is not right to disclose. There are times when it is not right to speak. And we're really careful to respect that. As a detail, in practice, we normally facilitate in pairs. I don't want to make this sound controlled, because the beauty is that in the end, the art in facilitating is to do as little as possible. I'm astonished. The more I learn to be quiet, the more I hear, the more is said. And it's, I don't know how to facilitate, is the truth. I do not know how to do it. I think it is such an amazingly creative and subtle thing. And it's an absolute privilege to be asked to facilitate conversation. And it's a kind of hidden gift. And in some of the comments we've made about conversation, comments which I absolutely accept, I think those comments are modified, they are reshaped by the presence of a facilitator, a gracious facilitator. And I'm underlining, actually, we have two, one of whom is active and one of whom is simply there. And it just gives an extra gentleness to the way in which the primary facilitator works, because they can give the slightest touch since they know there's someone else in the room. I think all this, I would want to say, is done, the facilitator is serving the group. The facilitator is the servant of the group. So again, I want to offer you observations, and if you read the script afterwards, you can reflect on how these fit, how they resonate for you. Are they part of your experience? I want to characterize facilitating as being about holding and shaping space as the servant of the group. I feel that very strongly, and I think it's hard to articulate without almost having consciously recognized and felt that. And I'm not for a second suggesting you don't all do it, but it may be that you don't articulate it in that way. Facilitation is about holding and shaping space as the servant of the group. And I want to make a further suggestion, and it's a suggestion that I'm not qualified to explore, so I'm not in a position to make it. But I want to suggest that that's a priestly role, and it's what we're doing in church as we gather people and as we journey together through our worship. We hold that space for people and for the Spirit to speak into. And again, it is our privilege to hold that space as the servant of the people and of the Spirit. I think what I want to say about these conversations in Retreat House, they are peculiar to Retreat House, you know, they are particular conversations. But I've heard people say the most astonishing things, completely unpredictably, most astonishing things. Of course, this will be within your own experience. It will be within your own experience pastorally. It will be within your own experience in groups. But it isn't mechanical. It isn't mechanical. It isn't something we can create. We all know that it is not our gift. It is not in our gift. But it is a gift that in this space, which itself is a gift, people offer to the group, or which the group offers through a person to the group. And the privilege of holding that space is that it means that you, and especially you, must be listening to each and every person and listening intently to the voice of the group. And it's a very, I don't know how to put it, it's almost an existential experience, and in that sense a privilege. It's just a remarkable experience to be completely exposed to everyone and to the group, and to be trying to serve all that simultaneously is a remarkable experience. And my last phrase about it is, it evokes for me the sense of trying to have peripheral vision, trying to see everything that's going on around, trying to see everything that's going on within the group. And yet it not being literally visual, maybe visual, maybe not, but that one is trying to absorb everything that is being said and to hold it and offer it back to the group, for the group to speak. Well, as you can imagine, if I were speaking in a group, I would stop, but we're on Zoom and we have a clock. But you can see why silence is so suggestive. I think one can feel why silence is so suggestive. One of the things we do towards the end of a conversation is we say, well, let's stop the conversation there. And of course, there's an art in deciding where we stop the conversation, as there is an artist in the artist who stops painting. When is the last brush stroke? Well, there is no right answer. When is the last comment? There is no answer, but you decide when it is. And then you say, let's just hold some silence and let's just see if you feel there's one thing you're going to take away. And I don't say you can do that here, but I just want to give you a sense for what the feeling of these conversations is like, and possibly something of the intensity of them, because you've done almost nothing. It's paradoxical. The intensity arises out of the silence, and yet of people speaking freely, of choosing freely to speak and choosing freely to listen. And it's quite extraordinary in its creativity. And I think this is true in our coming priestly role. Again, I would rather sit in silence, but I'm not going to, because I think my commission, as it were, is to speak and risk that I break the silence. And I'm sorry, because I don't want to, but I will. I would just like to indicate something further about Retreat House Chester. And I'm not here to represent them. I'm not here meaning they're in any way exclusively helpful in this. I'm just talking about things that I found helpful. But they're trying a new venture, which is called Reflective Chester. And what's interesting about it is it's aimed at what they would phrase non-religious outreach. It's aimed at giving opportunity for conversation to people and groups who might not normally be invited to intentional conversation. And that could be, I'm sorry, it always sounds patronizing, doesn't it? But people on the margins or people without a voice. And it's a conscious decision to not choose people who are practiced, who are polished in conversation, but to take the risk of offering that silence, offering that space. And I dare say being amazed by what people can say if they are invited and offered that space. So it's an experiment, and a number of us have been asked to train to facilitate those conversations. So it's an emerging thing. And of course, it could be that churches have equivalents, and that goes back to this first question, which was, if you like, bread on the water, or what sort of ideas have you had? Because one can try new things, and one can try conversations, and one can try conversations with people who aren't in conversations. Well, that's okay. We can try that. And I've perhaps said quite a bit, or what I've said I've quite intently about facilitation, because part of our responsibility would be the gentleness and the thoughtfulness of our facilitation for people who have not normally had a voice or are not normally invited, because not normally are they good enough for our conversations, but they're good enough for God's conversations. They're good enough to speak. They're good enough because they're like us, because God speaks through them. If it's comforting, and again, I'm not suggesting for a second you don't know about conversations, but if it's comforting, 9 of us have been in 3-hour sessions for 6 weeks. We've done 18 hours of training, and every one of us has found ourselves learning a great deal. And we're all of us experienced in conversations and in facilitating. I haven't met most of the people. I've met some of the people in these 9, but some of them I don't know at all. And I'm really amazed about the people they are. And yet we all find ourselves learning about conversation. And I find it so interesting that the initiative that they're taking is to go to people who aren't invited to conversations. And that says something about possibilities for church, I think, for possibilities in the parish, for possibilities in the community, that we can have deep conversations with people you don't have conversations with. We can hear things from people who don't speak, and we can be amazed. It struck me as I was making my notes, I did some last night and I was adding to them this morning, and I thought to say the very obvious thing, that I think if we want to see the genius of facilitation, we look to Jesus, we look to the stories, we look to the parables, we look to the man walking at 3 miles an hour, holding space, inviting people in, listening to them, respecting them, and shaping that space for people to speak, a space into which he speaks, a space into which he speaks 2,000 years later. I think that's something of the facilitation we aspire to. And somebody who speaks in extraordinarily ordinary terms. I think there is no special language for conversation, but there is something special about the space as there's something special about the space for worship. There's something special about that pastoral space. There is something special about the space for prayer. Jesus does seem to be at the center of that sort of space. And I think scripture perhaps is rich in conversation. I haven't thought to evidence that, as it were, and I just leave that thought with you. If it has truth in it, then perhaps as we look, we will see. I would just say from that, that in our parish in Christleton, we've consciously tried to adopt this style in reading together St. Mark's Gospel this Lent. And I hope this just helps illustrate how one can adapt anything. And our ambition was simply to sit alongside each other in two groups, as it turned out, one on a Wednesday morning, one on a Thursday night, on Zoom. So you can do this kind of stuff on Zoom. And to read the whole of Mark's Gospel over 6 weeks in each other's presence. And we didn't know how we would do that. We didn't know what the experience would be, but I suggested, well, why don't we read it in three, each set of texts, which roughly, as we know, is 2 or 3 chapters a week. That's how it turns out in the length of Mark. Why don't we break those into 3 readings each week? And why, after each reading, which is literally read aloud by one person, why don't we just have silence? Why don't we then say, would you each like to offer one thing that you noticed? And hold silence until people have had the chance. And then in what is a precious few minutes, say, would any of you like to respond to what's been said? And it was a bit of a journey to encourage people to allow everyone to offer something. And that sounds like a simple thing, but perhaps now I've explained a few things, it makes a little more sense that people are given the space to say one thing, and that everybody is invited before anybody starts making a response to what's been said. Everybody is invited to speak. They are perfectly welcome to not speak. There is never any pressure on someone to speak, but they're invited. And that was a journey because people couldn't get, they were oh yes, that's what I thought. They straight away wanted to comment, but eventually we learnt to say one thing and to have a little bit of silence. And I think out of that, over 6 weeks, I would say that we heard the gospel, and for some people that was a new experience, which perhaps you've come across. It sounds a remarkable thing, but it was a new thing for some people in those groups to hear the wholeness of the gospel. They'd never heard a gospel as a whole. And to hear each other, and very simple comments like, I didn't realize people thought so many different things about this, because for the first time they've listened to what other people think. And that I say that with absolutely no criticism, but if you've got 6 people in a group, almost certainly you'll get 6 different things, and that's not been a common experience, because the people who willingly speak will be the ones who speak. Whereas silence says, no, everyone can speak. And everyone says something. in our meetings, we took between 60 and 75 minutes. And the most we had, even in 75 minutes, was 30 minutes for the reflection, the silence, and the conversation. So the maximum we had was 10 minutes, and 10 minutes is not much, as you know. But what I'm offering out of, and again, this is just out of experience, I didn't know how that would work, but out of that experience, 10 minutes was enough for people to come to really value listening and listening to what other people said. And it spilt over into the attentiveness then to the gospel, that the gospel was listened to and other people were listened to, other people were listened to, and the gospel was listened to. The 10 minutes did not include us being able to analyze and to put upon either the gospel or the people, quote, what they were saying. And I don't think that mattered at all. I think the gospel speaks and I think the people spoke. And even in 10 minutes, it was in some way, my sense was in some way, it was a transforming experience. There was the rawness of the gospel speaking and the rawness that each person has a voice that did not need to be resolved. The gospel did not require that we explain what it meant. And the people did not require that their thought was worked out into some scheme of thought. There does seem to be a beauty about conversation that it has no end except the one it finds. And even 2 or 3 minutes from the end of a conversation, none of us knows what the completeness of that conversation will be. I think that's something of the genius of the group. And if the church is anything, then it is a group. And we are the servants of that group. Peace to this house, to those who enter, to those who dwell here, to those who depart. Peace.
Rob, thank you so much for all this rich material to get us thinking about our roles in building community and in conversation and living together, and our roles as facilitators and as priests. Many things struck me from what you were saying, but probably particularly when you were talking about reflective Chester and facilitating conversations of those who are marginalized. It made me wonder just how sacrificial the role of facilitator in conversation is, and how painful and painstaking that role can be, and particularly in absorbing the tensions and pain of the group living together. And it made me think that the facilitator becomes the suffering servant, not just the servant, but the suffering servant of the suffering group. And of course, that made me wonder about ourselves as priests. And you linked it beautifully with our liturgical function. But also, it seems to work so well with the person of Christ, the suffering servant of the suffering people. I'm sure many of us have got thoughts arising from what you said, and hopefully we'll have opportunities to share them going forward as we continue formation. But I just want to thank you on behalf of the group. And I don't know whether anybody else has got one thing that they would like to say, and then we will close. Is there anything anybody else would like to say?
I found the silences really helpful, and I think the speed at which you delivered was really helpful for processing and taking on board that information.
Thank you.
Alison has said thank you in the chat. Okay. So let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
In the name of Christ.
Christ. Amen.
As I said, I'll keep the Zoom session going for anybody who wants to stay and have a chat. Okay.
Thank you.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Rob. I'm off to do Easter with Ramsgate. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Lots to think about.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you.
Take care now. We'll see you soon. Thanks, Rob.
Hey, Debbie.
Dave, just let you know you're still recording.